The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. As Jesus was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a sizable crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind man, the son of Timaeus, sat by the roadside begging. On hearing that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me." And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he kept calling out all the more, "Son of David, have pity on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, get up, Jesus is calling you." He threw aside his cloak, sprang up, and came to Jesus. Jesus said to him in reply, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man replied to him, "Master, I want to see." Jesus told him, "Go your way. Your faith has saved you." Immediately he received his sight and followed him on the way. The Gospel of the Lord. Enabling is the encouragement of a dysfunctional behavior, an apparent help, but that doesn't help. On the contrary, makes the hole deeper. And this could be enforced by others, but it can also be personally inflicted. Bartimaeus, the man in the Gospel today, was living a lifestyle of enabling. We cannot judge his heart, of course, but we know that external attitudes, they show the internal dispositions and unseen dispositions. Bartimaeus was comfortable with his situation. He had settled and adjusted. Not every blind man in the time of Bartimaeus was laying down by the side of the road and begging. In this way, Bartimaeus, he can represent something present also in us, our fear to change. The Forbes magazine shows that only 32% of people like change in their lives, while 68%, the rest of us, resist it. That's why we fall into our enabling behavior. We prefer to accommodate to the bad situation that we know rather than something better that implies unknown changes. We prefer to develop mechanisms to cope with the interior sickness, to hide it, to live with it, so much that we can get to the point of thinking that there's nothing wrong. And one more thing needs to be said. Most of us don't hate change, but we resist transition. That's what we really resist. I would love to be more prayerful, centered in Christ, to be more profound and not be running all the time. I would love to be more loving to others who are different and maybe I have a hard time loving. We're all in love with the change. I would love to be more responsible and not to let so much time leak in my days. What we despise is the transition that is messy, that is emotional, that is unfamiliar, that takes time. And for this particular reason, we prefer enabling to changing. And we adjust to our current situation. Bartimaeus, in the first community, he became almost like an icon that it is possible to change. And that's why we know his name, and he was known in the first community, and probably his name and his story was passed on from generations to generations all the way to us as he was placed in the gospel. Because he had the courage to undergo the necessary transition and to change. People would refer to him to show that it is possible. What did he do? There was one key thing that Bartimaeus did in his life. He had to heed the voice of the Son of David, a different voice to all other voices that enabled him in his own behavior. This was the voice of God that could bring change into his life. It is God's nature to call. He calls, of course, to follow him. He calls for missions. But every time that God calls us to himself is in order to heal us, to bring us to something different. There's more than 15 callings in the Old Testament. The Son himself was called by the Father as high priest, as we read in the second reading today. During his life and ministry, Jesus called many to follow him and to conversion. For example, the first disciples that he called at the beginning of his public life. He called them to drop their nets and to follow him as fishers of men. He demanded their whole lives, and they became almost the archetype of any calling. But we also read that Jesus called Nicodemus in the middle of the night to be born again. He called the Samaritan woman in the middle of the day to find a deeper thirst. He called a rich young man, as we read a couple Sundays ago, to invest on a new treasure in heaven. He also called Martha to invest on the greatest treasure on earth. We can say that the ministry of Jesus was one of calling. And from all these calls and from the one of Bartimaeus, we can draw a conclusion about the way Jesus calls. How he used to call, and how does he call us to conversion today. For the many things that we could say, whether he calls us through the voice of others or by an internal voice that speaks into the heart, Jesus always calls out of something and into something new, into something else. Like Bartimaeus, Jesus called him out of his blindness into sight, from beggar to benefactor, from a poor relationship with God to a renewed relationship with God. He called him out of his particular situation into something new. And Jesus doesn't require us to see perfectly all that it entails to follow his voice. He calls the blind. But what we need to be able to do is to listen when he calls. So how can we better embrace change in our lives? There's 3 lessons from the life of Bartimaeus that he has been teaching for generations of Christians, and they come to us. The first lesson that we can learn from Bartimaeus is that he is done with his situation. He is done. Bartimaeus was fed up, we could say, with his situation. He was tired and ready to leave it behind. He renounces that lifestyle. He is no longer the blind man, the beggar, the quiet one who needs to be taken care of. He renounces the privileges, we could say, of that label in order to start living in a life of freedom, in fullness. He leaves it behind. This is the last day, never again. You can have the cloak and the money. I am not coming back. I'm getting out of this situation. So we can see that Bartimaeus, he was done with that situation. And I fear that sometimes we don't undergo that transition or that change in our lives because we are not totally fed up. We are not totally confronted with how bad the situation is. And so we still compromise, enable ourselves. I just heard the testimony of this woman from the San Juan Diego community. Wonderful woman. I know her as a leader, and I have always known her as a very joyful person pouring herself out to others. She's the leader of one of the communities, an amazing person. But the other day she told me her story of how she was immersed in depression before she found Christ. After she had her first daughter, this depression came to her, and she never came out of that and started to live a life of depression. It got so bad that it became almost like an identity in her life, and started spreading out in her family and to others. And people, would take care of her at times, and she would have to, some friends would come to her home so that she would eat. She was at that point of not functioning very well, until she heard the voice of someone who spoke something different to her. Another woman who had already encountered Christ through the San Juan Diego program. And she came to her and said, you don't need to live this way. I have encountered Christ, and He has healed me. She had also undergone some depression herself and had been healed just by listening to the voice of the Lord and following Him. So in the same way that this woman was done with that situation, willing to go for something different, Bartimaeus was as well. In the second place, Bartimaeus heeded the voice of Jesus. He heeds His voice. Bartimaeus was able to listen to that call. He heard Jesus preach, probably, and he knew that there was something more. Bartimaeus calls Jesus the Son of David. That is a clear messianic title that is always used in reference to God who saves and who can bring some change into our lives. That is the title, for example, used at the entrance in Jerusalem. The Son of David, save us. That great cheer of joy. So that is what Bartimaeus is yelling out, because he knows who Jesus is. He probably heard Him preaching before. And he hears now His voice. There is a voice different to all other voices that help him to acknowledge and recognize that there's something wrong, that there's something that could be different, that his true blindness was interior and not so much the exterior one. And this is the only voice that doesn't enable but calls us to what we are capable of, because He knows what we are capable of, what we are made for. So he was able to listen in the silence of his heart to that voice calling out. And in the third place, he is not going to let the opportunity go. He is resolved, and he's willing to undergo anything that he needs to do. He yells his lungs out. Someone will have to pay attention. He's not quieting down. Doesn't matter how much they ask him to be silent. He wants to change, and he's finally ready to embrace that transition. He's resolved. He's done with his situation, but the Lord is not done with him, and he's willing to do anything that he has to do. So I would say that those are the three main characteristics that made Bartimaeus a man open to change or to transition in his life. And he's a model for all of us on how to embrace with hope the transition that Christ wants us to undergo. So I want to propose three things that we can do in this week in order to embrace change in our lives. And this is a triple offering: the offering of our heart, the offering of our ears, and the offering of our feet every day. In the first place, the offering of our hearts, to be able to recognize what are those areas that I'm just enabling. I'm just not willing to change. I'm just like coping in a way that I encourage that dysfunctional behavior in my life. To be able to see that in our hearts, as Bartimaeus was able to see. In the second place, our ears, to be able to listen to the voice of the Lord and what He wants for us, what He has in store for us, what we are capable of, what He can speak. And in the third place, our feet, to be able to walk that path, to be able to move in transition, to be able to move towards that change as Bartimaeus did. He threw out his cloak, he sprang up, and he ran to the Lord. Imagine many years after this episode, when the Lord was already ascended into heaven, Bartimaeus, he would have retold the story to other people and to the Christian communities. And that's how he made it into the Gospels. He probably told it many, many times. And people would ask him, how do you do it, Bartimaeus? And he would respond exactly with these things. You know, I was just done with my situation. I wanted a change in my life. I just heard him call my name, call me to himself. I was not going to let that opportunity go. I was willing to do anything that I had to do to undergo that change. But he would always say, I am sure, but truly he has done it all. I only responded to his call.